morning, everybody, and welcome to this leadership episode of 30 Minutes to President's Club. My name is Armand Farrokh, and I'm here with my co-host, Nick Cegelski. And today, we have the CRO over at Cantata, and holy smokes, did he put on a show. It is the one and only JD Miller. Nick, why should people listen?
I learned a ton from JD on this one. He talks about everything from how to proactively communicate information about pipe gen, attainment, etc., a real look at your business upwards to your leadership team and your board. He talks about how then you can work with your frontline managers to get a really, really tight pulse on the health of your sales force. And then he also goes and dispels, or rather teaches, errors, technical errors and so if you are someone who wants to be a CRO, you have a ton to learn from JD. If you are someone who is a CRO, you have a ton to learn from him.
All right, JD, welcome to the show. We start every leadership show with your top 3 actionable takeaways. Let's get your 3.
Takeaway number 1 is to send a weekly flash report to all of the stakeholders in your business around bookings and pipeline generation. So what does that mean? It's a weekly email that goes to everyone who cares about the state of the sales organization. So it's all of my frontline sales managers, my VPs, every member of the executive leadership team, and our board members. What's in the email? It is a summary of revenue production over the last week and lead generation over the last week. That data is broken down by team and by region.
Boom. What's number 2?
The second is to have a monthly talent review with each of my frontline managers. A lot of times I've been a chief revenue officer for a couple of years now. I've had as many as 175 sellers. It is not possible for me to have a one-on-one relationship with every one of those sellers, but they all expect that I know something about them. And I want to be sure that whoever's managing them is managing them as appropriately as possible. So once a month with each of my direct reports, I have a conversation with the frontline managers of any seller to talk about individual rep performance. The meeting includes me, the frontline manager, someone from sales operations, and our HR business partner. And we look at both qualitative and quantitative metrics. On the quantitative side, I have the sales operations participant come deliver rep by rep how they're performing against quota and what their pipeline looks like compared to where they need to be. And then on the qualitative side, I have the frontline manager talk about what's going on with the person. Are they a retention risk? Are they a flight risk? Do they have overall morale issues? Are there interventions we need to do or training issues or different things like that? The outcome of this meeting then is the ability for us to have a plan going forward, rep by rep, on knowing what's going well with them, what's not, and how we can continue to improve performance over the next 30 days.
We're going to dive deep into that in just a second. But first, bring us home. What's number 3?
Number 3 is outsourcing your board reporting to your senior leaders. I've spent a lot of time working in private equity-backed B2B SaaS companies. And one thing you know about working in that environment is every month there's a massive board packet that you need to produce that lays out the performance of each of the divisions and what the goals are for the next 30 days, 90 days, rest of the year. Rather than assembling all of that myself, this year I started to outsource it to my key leaders. So I provided each of them with a template that looks at their business. It gives them space to put in all of the structured metrics around what production has looked like, what pipeline has looked like, how many open headcount they have. And then for things that aren't going particularly well, there's a narrative where they talk about what's our remediation plan. Now, I don't take that report and just glue it together and send it off to the board. The first thing that I do is I use it in my one-on-ones with the leader so that we're having a good conversation about what's going well, what's not, what needs to happen strategically to move that region forward. I'm putting my own spin on that, and then I package that up and put it in my board review. But what I found is that by having a collaboration between me and the team leader in that development, it's reduced the amount of time that I have to spend calling what the weather is today, tracking down a lot of structured data. And it's also gotten the frontline manager more involved in understanding their business and why things are working or aren't.
Awesome. So JD, I want to talk a bit about these frontline manager monthly talent reviews that you are doing. This sounds like a really important meeting for you to understand the health of your sales force. I am assuming that it is really easy for these meetings to go off the rails. And so I want to learn a little bit more about how you structure these, how you budget your time, and the flow of these meetings.
So usually this discussion is happening in the context of an existing one-on-one. Every week I have at least a 30-minute one-on-one with each of my direct reports. And so when we're doing talent review, it replaces the one-on-one, or it's the sole agenda for those 30 minutes. I also am a really strong believer that a span of control for any frontline manager is no more than 8 sellers. If you have 8 direct reports, it gives you basically an hour a day to coach each of them if you had nothing else going on. And any more than that is too much for someone to manage. So within 30 minutes, that manager and I are reviewing 8 direct reports. It gives us really 4 or 5 minutes a report, a seller to talk about. So it's not a ton of time, but the way to use that time really efficiently is, first of all, to start with the metrics. What's the person's quota? What's their attainment against it? Very quickly, what has that looked like in the last month and the last quarter? And then forward looking, what's their pipeline? Do we think they're likely to achieve their quota or not? You can get through that metrics discussion in about a minute. And then the qualitative discussion comes from the frontline manager, which is really the description of why that is. So a seller who's not making their quota, what's going on with them? There's all kinds of things that come out in those discussions that frontline managers know that I don't know. Maybe someone's just had a baby. I had a seller whose parents were recently diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and so they were getting ready to take some extended leave. Having that kind of qualitative discussion that someone who knows the seller on a daily basis can bring to the understanding of the structured metrics really gives us a bigger picture of what's going on with that particular seller in that territory. And from there, we can have a discussion about, so what are we going to do about it? A lot of times organizations think that if you're looking at your seller and you're measuring performance and you're talking about are they achieving expectations or not, it automatically leads into some sort of an exit discussion. And that's not what this is about. Yes, there are times that you'll look at a seller who's not making their quota, they have no pipeline, and they have no motivation to get there. And certainly we should talk about how do we exit them. But I think the most important part of this conversation is before a seller is a total lost cause, we can start to identify what are the issues that are creating challenges for them? Maybe it's something in their personal life. Maybe it's something structural about their territory or product offering. The truth of the matter is, once you have this kind of on a monthly basis, you don't actually spend 5 minutes on every seller. There's a bunch of sellers that you can go through really quickly and say, everything's green, they're a happy employee, we're wonderful there, we don't need to spend any time with them. And then some of the other sellers fill up more time based on their unique circumstances.
What is your expectation for how a manager comes prepared to these meetings?
So I expect that the manager, before we've even had the meeting, is having a weekly one-on-one with their seller. They're on top of the details of what's going on in the territory, how's pipeline going, and what has that manager been coaching that seller on? Everyone has skills that need to get improved, me included. And so the manager, I really expect to have their fingertips on the latest data. What does it say about what development needs to happen? And also a plan for what are they doing now? So that as we have the discussion, it's a really candid conversation that's bringing me up to speed and helping me figure out how I can support them in whatever they're trying to do developmentally.
So let's say that I have a rep who has been the classic hit, miss, hit, miss, hit, miss rep. And next quarter, it looks like they're just going to be slightly below quota. What would an example of a good update be from a manager? An update that you feel like is satisfactory and they're focused on solving the problem.
So I think the first thing that I'm expecting is the manager knows that is the pattern, that it's been hit and miss. And I would love the manager to have a point of view about why is that? Is the seller spending so much time closing business that they're not doing any pipeline development? Is the seller is it a motivation issue? That the sellers made enough money and they don't have to keep running through the tape, and so they're just not motivated to perform in the next month? Is it something else entirely? So the manager should understand the data and have a point of view on why it is, and then should be open to just a candid discussion about what do we think about that? What do we want to do about it? Are there incentive things that we should be doing? Are there training things we should be doing? And really responsive to, I'll probably have 3 or 4 suggestions. Have you tried this? Would you consider this? Have you talked to them about this? Is there something else that I can do or you can do or the organization can do to smooth out the performance there?
So your expectation, JD, is that the manager understands the data and has a POV on, hey, here's what's going on and here's how we are going to fix this. I presume that you have some first-time or maybe less skilled managers who struggle in that area. What coaching or direction do you give them here?
So first-time manager, we've got to spend other sorts of time outside of this meeting helping them think about some of this strategic stuff. And so that's part of my job, coaching them. A first-time manager who doesn't have a sense of what's going on with each of these sellers, I'm not going to go rep by rep and have them 8 times say, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. I'm probably going to start a little bit higher level and say, let's summarize them in a table. Let's look at where performance is. And then I'm going to provide some suggestions or some insights and say, what do you think about this? Is it possible that your sellers don't have enough pipeline? Is it possible that the territories are misaligned? Is it possible that we've been keeping them too busy with meetings to be able to spend time doing this sort of stuff? And I'm going to give them some possibilities to think about and wrestle with, and then start to shape their point of view there. Ultimately, I don't care if their opinion is right or wrong. What I care is that I'm developing a manager who knows how to think. And that's actually when I'm hiring sales managers. I think a sales manager is different than just the best seller who got promoted because they sold the most. Sales managers really need to have a curiosity in my organization about what is the business, why do things happen the way that they do. And so I'm really looking to recruit managers who are going to be thoughtful, curious, want to dive into data and start hypothesizing about what it means, and be open to coaching with me on that kind of stuff too. If you're just a frontline manager who wants to track metrics and say, did you make 500 calls today? Yes, no, and move on. That's not really the right kind of manager in my organization.
I see that this is infused in a lot of how you are working with your direct reports, even if we go back to the actionable takeaway of like how they're helping with the board communications that you're doing. I hear what you're saying from like a qualitative, like what you're looking for in someone who you're going to bring up to be a manager. But my guess is there are some, what you might call technical skills that someone who's been a great IC is just lacking when they come into your org as a manager. And I'm wondering, like, what are some of those skills?
So when I'm promoting an individual contributor to be a first-time manager, as we're having the discussion, the first conversation we're having is that the skills to be a great individual contributor are not necessarily the same skill sets to manage people. Some of that is very basic cultural personality stuff. Usually your top seller, it's all about me. I want the awards. I want the accolades. I'm there because I'm super competitive and I want the attention of, I was number one seller. I always coach those folks when they become a frontline manager that the spotlight isn't going to be on you at all. It's about collaboration. It's about pushing accolades down to your team members. And it's also about coaching them so that they can be as good as you were. So I used to have a leader who talked about let your managers make mistakes or let your sellers make mistakes, but know when they're going to blow off a finger or blow off an arm. A lot of great sellers know that your top sellers knew how to do a perfect execution on every single deal. When they start to manage folks, they need to recognize that their sellers aren't going to be perfect in every deal, and that the best learnings are going to happen from letting them mess up a couple of ideas. And so first-time manager, one big skill for us to think about is what are the lessons you're going to let your sellers learn by failing? And what are the failures we can absorb as an organization? That I just lost a finger versus where are the times that you're going to have to really step in and take the reins and do it yourself? And that's that kind of lost an arm thing. The other thing I try to teach a first-line manager about is how to train skills in your sellers. My dad was a surgeon. Now, he went to medical school like 50 years ago. And I asked him, how did you learn surgery? And he said, we had this thing called watch one, do one, teach one. Now, I suspect today that doctors are doing more than watching one surgery before they're in there themselves. But I like that methodology with my sales leaders is if you've got someone who's never had an experience before, how do you first let them watch someone do it? Then how do you let them do it themselves? And then finally, how do you have them turn around and teach it to someone else? And so a frontline manager who's got a seller who doesn't know how to do something, it's perfectly appropriate for that frontline manager to come in on a sales call and take the reins and do the thing that needs to get done. But then go talk to the seller after the fact and say, you saw me do it. The next time you're going to do it, I'm going to sit in the back and be your support.
JD, there are so many different things we could talk about as it pertains to annual planning. And I know you're going to link an example annual plan template in the show notes. So I will save the entire annual plan for that. My question is, one of the places where annual planning can go wrong most is in your assumptions around ramp. I know this varies a lot based on deal cycle, But let's assume that you're in the sales motion that you're in today. How do you go about estimating time to ramp in your annual plan?
So I'm a really data-driven leader, and I hope that we have data on prior performance. It might be a little bit tedious if you don't have a really great data analytics tool, but can you look at each of the sellers you have in your organization today, and can you look back to whenever they were hired, what did they produce every month or every quarter to understand what that onboarding and ramp time looked like? Now that's going to change business by business. I've worked in some big enterprise sales organizations with multi-million-dollar deals. It took 9 months or 12 months for sellers to get fully ramped. I've worked in organizations that have really small transactional things and the seller's getting their first deal in 6 weeks. And so the questions that we need to ask are, the people who are in seat right now, who are performing, how long did it take for them to reach that level of performance? And use that as the baseline assumption. Or I should say, use the average performance of everyone as your baseline assumption. A big thing that everyone who works with me hears me say is the best predictor of future performance is past performance. So not just on ramp time when we're setting the annual plan, but also as we set off the year, what does turnover look like? How many people typically leave your organization? Or how many years does someone typically work for you as a seller before they move on to something else? And you can be pretty predictive about how many sellers are going to leave. Often you can be predictive about what time of the year they're going to leave. And that can start you on a recruiting path to backfill and start building in your annual plan. First of all, remove the performance of a top seller because one of them is likely to leave halfway through the year. And then number two, how long will it take me to recruit a replacement? And how long will it take them to ramp up and be more effective? It's a big spreadsheet. I'll send you the link afterwards. It's a good template that you can use. That's one of the biggest things that I spend time in at the beginning of the year.
So you have a couple different components of this plan. Is you have your existing reps minus the reps that are leaving plus the new reps that are joining. Let's assume that we've used this template, we've set up our plan, and God knows this plan would take a long time to build, but I'm going to assume that we have a plan in place. Now your goal is to beat the plan as soon as possible. And the way you do that is you squeeze more out of your existing reps, you ramp your reps faster, etc. What would an example 3-month ramp plan look like for a mid-market rep? And if I'm a manager, how do I go about ramping a mid-market rep?
So I've been really fortunate. I work in larger organizations that also, I have a great sales ops team, but I also typically have at least one person whose job is sales enablement, who really owns the execution of training for our sellers. And I'm a really big fan of having a 90-day training program for anyone new to the organization that does what I call just-in-time training. Years and years ago, I worked for IBM, and they sent us off to somewhere in New York for 3 weeks, and we were in a classroom for 8 hours a day, every day for 3 weeks, and we left, and they said, "You have now learned the IBM method of selling." That doesn't really work for people anymore. Instead, what I try to do is break all of the training topics down into what do you need to know to do the first part of your job? And how can I spoon feed you a little bit of training, a little bit of doing, and then come back and give you a little more training? So what might that look like? First couple of days on the job, a little bit of training to understand your territory, how to get into Salesforce or your CRM, and just read the reports on who your top accounts are, who your prospects are, and so on. Once you're able to do that, next little bit of training is going to be, what's our elevator pitch? How do you make a phone call? And now you're going to go off and go call a few people in your territory and try and set a few meetings. Once you've got a meeting set, then we're going to do the next little bit of training on how do you present the first PowerPoint pitch or demo or discussion. So you're feeding people as they need to know across that 90-day onboarding. That's giving them a chance to learn, a chance to do, and most importantly, have a chance to actually progress their territory kind of from day one, beginning the prospecting or the relationship building or whatever the things are in your sales playbook.
Yeah, when I was ramping reps in SMB and mid-market sales, oftentimes we would want to have people on calls by the end of the 30 days. And so we would set these mini milestones where throughout the 30 days, they would slowly progress from learning in the classroom to doing. And so in week 1, the milestone was we got to get your hands on your territory and we got to get you tiering your book. And that teaches you our ICP. In week 2, I want to get you on the phones. I want to get you in the fray, prospecting a little bit. By week 3, you should know the high level discovery talk tracks, you should know the demo talk tracks, and that's the mock week. So you're doing 1 million mocks. By week 4, you're taking SMB and disqualified calls. So you're in the real action. And then week 5, you're in the action, taking live supervised sales calls. And then from there, the manager just slowly steps back 1 footstep at a time. Whether you're an enterprise, mid-market, or SMB, you either stretch this out further and further, or you compact it when you're in more transactional sales motion. But I think we're talking about pretty similar ways of stepping back.
That's exactly what I love to see happening in the organization. And it also gives people a big sense of success. One of the other kind of related topics that often comes in here with ramping sellers or new sellers is this issue of how do I pay them during their training period? A lot of sellers, as they're interviewing for the job, say, it's going to take how long for me to ramp? Can I have commission draw? And I hate commission draw. I always say, no, I'm not going to do that, but I will figure out what would your earnings be on a quarterly basis when you're fully ramped? And I'll let you earn that if you achieve MBOs that are tied to exactly these kinds of things. So if you're following the training process and you have conducted the right number of meetings or set the right number of first discovery calls or advanced enough deals from stage 2 to 3, you maybe haven't closed the deal yet, but we can give you an MBO during that ramping period so that you can maintain your earnings. And I think that's a lot more sensible than just commission draws that, frankly, you're never going to be able to get back if they leave the organization or don't perform at the end anyway.
So, JD, we were talking about this theme of beating the plan that you set out. And I heard a couple things that we talked about. One is like, how can you accelerate and really improve the ramp time and experience? The other would be like, how do you squeeze the most out of each seller on the team? I presume, however, there are other levers that you are thinking about when you lay out a plan to say, okay, great, here are some of my options for how I can make sure that we beat this plan. And I'm curious what those levers are for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you said, one of the biggest things are levers that aren't about squeezing my sellers or my team at all, but the rest of the organization. I've written a book, it's the CRO's Guide to Doing All of This, and I lay all of the details out in that. But once I've written the plan, I start circulating that through other members of the executive leadership team. And we talk about, here's regular performance, just at regular run rate. But what else might happen in the organization that could improve this? Might we be launching a new product? Might we be working with ops on some sort of a different structure to our contracts? Is there something that customer success might do that we can outperform retention so we don't have to backfill as many churned accounts because we're retaining more of them? Is there something with marketing going? All of these different things that other members of the organization might commit to that could improve the total company's performance. And I don't like to build those into the plan as expectations, but I like to line them out as if they went well, what might we expect? So that we orient the whole company and the board to, here's the baseline that we know we can commit. And also this year, we're going to try do these 3 or 4 things. Maybe it's a different training program. Maybe it's a new product launch. Who knows what it is? And then for each of those assumptions, we can map out if it goes, here's the increase we'll see. Maybe it's a 1% increase on our win rate. If it goes really well, what might we see? And we can play all of that too. So when we're doing those monthly flash reports or those quarterly looks, we can track how are we doing against the plan, but then on each of those kind of stretch initiatives, we can have a discussion about how are we doing on those too, and how do I start enrolling the other leaders in the company to, have us outperform those assumptions. And together, that's really what makes us overperform.
So you talked about a 1% increase on win rate, and there was something that you had put in the prep document, which was you should be cautious about thinking that you can improve any one metric by a really big amount. And my question for you is, for someone who's thinking about doing this, they've got a plan and they're thinking about improving a lever to beat plan, what advice would you have for them about the sizing of their expectations in terms of improvement? And then 2, how they message that to the rest of the leadership team and to the board so that they don't just sound like they're, sandbagging or being really, really pessimistic about their ability to improve anything.
Yeah. I think when I spend so much time talking about the plan, it drives the board and the ELT kind of crazy in the fourth quarter, because I really want everyone to understand what is the basis for the assumptions we're putting into it. So if I'm doing a new training program, whoever's selling you the training says, here's our key customer, they increased their win rate 10%. You can't go put the 10% in your plan. You've really got to say, what's realistic? Is every seller going to improve? Are 5% of our sellers going to improve? Again, a ramping, we put in new training. How long is it going to take to see the effect of that training? And I like to be really conservative in those expectations. But when we're talking about performance, and even when we're doing our forecasts, I always have three numbers. I have my commit number, I have my best case number, and then I have my forecast, which is something in the middle. So whether I'm projecting how we're going to close in a quarter, or I'm projecting what's the impact this training is going to have on us, I can absolutely commit that it's not going to get worse. Very best case, they have a case study that said someone like us improved 7%. My forecast is it's maybe 2 or 3. And let's then build into the plan. We could be very conservative and forecast the commitment, or we could forecast our forecast and bake that into the plan. And that's how we get there. I think these conversations, though, are the most important ones that we have as sales leaders. The average tenure of a VP of sales is 18 months. And I believe that people aren't getting turned over out of their head of sales role because they're not hitting the number. I think more likely they're getting fired quickly because they don't have control over how they're getting to the result they're getting to. So a lot of times I've stepped into new roles where I'm the new head of sales in charge, and my first board meetings, I'm here to tell you, we're not going to make the number you set off, you expected from us. That's okay, as long as I can also explain why and what we're going to do about it and how long it's going to take to change the situation, and what are the leading indicators we should be looking at on each point in time.
An old mentor of mine used to say, missing your goal is bad. Missing your forecast is death.
Absolutely.
Look, you might not be able to control the fact that your CEO or your CFO is pushing a higher goal than you want, but you can absolutely control the number that you call. And so my final question to you, JD, is whether you're annual planning and you're setting that forecast number versus your commit number, whether you're just a manager forecasting your monthly number and you have a sense of where you're actually going to land versus where your goal is, how do you think about what you forecast versus what you commit?
So I always like to deliver both of those numbers together. And maybe it's trying to get everyone else a shared sense of ownership. I absolutely cannot miss my commitment. I really like to always communicate. Here's the committed number that we know this is what we're going to deliver. So if you're thinking about expense management or whatever else, run your business assuming this is going to happen. I'm forecasting something more than our commitment, and I like to give a little bit of narrative. Here's the 3 deals we think we're forecasting, and you can have some kind of quick summary that says, they told us we're vendor of choice, but we haven't done legal contracts, or they're not sure about this piece of the product, but if we can promise them, we'll do a customization or whatever. So you are getting other people understanding what's your thinking that's leading to the number. I think the worst sales leaders are ones who just sit in a corner and just throw out a number and say, that's it, good luck. And I think there are a lot of leaders who, if the seller just throws out a number, will take it and rely on it and won't probe to ask why. And so if that seller's throwing out a number that doesn't have meat behind it and no one's inspected it, that's where you're going to get to a lot of disappointment. So I think the best leaders, you're giving your numbers, you're giving some consumable rationale for how you got there. And now you've got everyone on the same page believing the same thing.
And last question is, how big is the difference between your commitment and your forecast of where you think you're going to land?
It really does vary on the length of your sales cycle and the size of your deals, and actually the makeup of what's happening on it in a given month. I might have a sales team that's got a $5 million commitment, and the best case for them might be $6 million because they've got 20 deals all worth some small amount. I might have the same organization I've got a $5 million commitment, and they only have one other deal in stretch, and it's worth $3 million. So then we're probably not forecasting it. We're probably saying we're committing 5. I'm really only forecasting 5. We might surprise ourselves and do 8, and it's all hinging on this one particular deal. So it really does depend.
So good. JD, amazing episode. Whether you are aspiring to be a CRO or whether you are a manager trying to figure out how to forecast for the first time, we got something out of this. The final question for you is as follows. We talked about a lot of good habits that leaders can exhibit. It's time to talk about a bad one. And so what is one bad habit that every sales leader out there should break so that all sales teams can get a little bit better?
The one habit we should break is thinking it's all about you. Earlier today, we talked about those first-time managers who used to be an individual contributor and now are managing a team. And I think the ones that aren't doing really well with it are the ones who just think it means I'm a Superman seller and now I have 8 people who are going to bring leads to me that I'm going to close. The best leaders are ones who realize that they're a piece of a larger organization that has lots of resources available to them. So it's not just about what I do as a sales leader or my sales team does. It's about what is product doing, what's legal doing, what's ops, what's training, what's everyone else in the organization doing. And the better I can get at sharing the load, communicating with those other people instead of shutting them out and saying, I've got it and I'm the only one responsible, the better it's going to be for me.
Boom. Amazing show, JD. Everyone hang on for a 60-second recap coming up soon. Alrighty, Nick, it is time for a 2x2 recap from this episode with JD Miller. Nick, what do you have for your 2?
First one is the Frontline Manager Talent Pulse meeting. And what this is, it's going to fit into your typical rhythm of your one-on-ones with the Frontline Manager, so you don't have to schedule a whole separate meeting. But the folks in that meeting are you, the Frontline Manager, your HR partner, and sales ops. And you are looking at both quantitative and qualitative information about each seller that reports to that frontline manager. When you get in a rhythm here, what happens is you know what's going on with your sales force, both from a attainment, where they need to improve, and how they are doing perspective. Number 2 was typically the most capacity that a frontline manager can take on is 8 sellers. Any more than that, and you will not have control over your sales force, and things will start to get a little bit shaky.
Number 3. The 90-day just-in-time onboarding plan. The number one way to beat your plan is by beating the ramp expectations. The way you do that is you start by training and you try to get them doing, and then you accelerate to more and more doing over time. In week 1, that might be they're in their territory, then you get them prospecting, then you get them in mocks, then you get them in live calls, and you slowly get them the training wheels. And then lastly, number 4, you have your commitment, which is what many people will call your worst case. And then you have your forecast, which is where you actually think you will land. And you might be at a $5 million commitment, but you might have a $3 million best case deal that makes your forecast or your upside $8 million. And so make sure that you deliver both of those numbers when you're reporting out to your CEO, to your board, what have you. Alrighty, Nick, how can people help us out here?
Yes, actually, Armand. I know that recently you put together one of our newsletter editions where you detailed how to forecast, and you showed some examples of what you would communicate when you were the VP of sales at Pave. And so, folks, if you want some best practices from 30 MPC around how you should be forecasting, there's a link in the show notes. Get it. It's free. Hopefully it helps you communicate your numbers. We'll see you next week on the show.